Welcome to our inaugural webinar for this, it's not the academic year, whatever, the TESOL calendar of our teacher educator interest section. And our theme this year is storytelling in language education and language teacher education. At our business meeting at the TESOL convention this year, we had a lot of ideas floating around about a theme for our year, and they all sort of coalesced around this idea of storytelling. So I'm very excited to welcome our first webinar speakers for this year, and that is Rachel Tanselli and Leila Rosa. I'll read a bio for you for our speakers. Rachel, am I saying your last name right? Is it Tanselli or is it Tancelli?
Tancelli, you're close. Tancelli.
Okay, there we go. So Rachel Tancelli has been a language educator for over 25 years. In addition to teaching language in Europe and the USA, she has also worked as an ELL program director and TESOL teacher educator. She currently teaches ESOL at Northeastern University in Boston, Massachusetts, and is an educational consultant for K-12 districts in the USA. Our other speaker, Leila Rosa, has been in the field of education for over 20 years, and during this time, she has held positions as a K-12 teacher at multiple grades, a bilingual special education evaluator, an education workshop developer, a special education staffing specialist, an instructional coach, a teacher educator, and TESOL graduate program director. Her work focuses on the intersection of multilingual learners and special education. She's an educational consultant for K-12 districts in the USA. So welcome to both of our speakers. We are so glad you are here. Thank you to our audience members for joining. And the title of their talk today is The Power of Stories, Transforming TESOL Teacher Education. So I will turn it over to our speakers.
Thank you so much. Please know that we are so happy that you're here with us, and we're truly excited and honored to being asked to participate in the teacher education interest session for the invitation. And I had no idea we were the first. Did you know that, Rachel?
I did, actually.
That is a lot of responsibility.
Yeah,
but
we hope to live up to it.
I know. Thank you so much for being here. In this very brief 60 minutes, we will tell you about the power of stories in a study that we conducted in a teacher preparation program. But we're going to begin. I'm going to let Rachel quickly tell you a little bit about herself, the more important parts about herself.
Thank you so much, Leila. So since this is a webinar series and our research really is about the power of storytelling, we thought it would be important to just tell you a little bit about ourselves beyond the bio that Heather so graciously presented. And I think that one thing I would love all of you to know about me is, in addition to what you heard about my professional background, is that I'm bilingual and I'm a bilingual mom. So I have 3 bilingual children, and this work that I do in supporting multilingual students and in supporting the teachers of multilingual students is also deeply personal to me. And part of the story that I think is also really important is this wonderful collaboration I have with Leila. We've established a partnership that's very open, a safe space. We can sort of really count on each other to be honest and to be supportive. And that's an important piece of, I think, the research as we come to the findings you'll hear. And it's just always a great pleasure to be collaborating with her. She's a very, very talented professional, as you heard from that amazing bio. Leila?
Oh, and wow, thank you very much.
Welcome.
I'll tell you that I came to the United States at the age of 17. I'm originally African. I was born in the islands of Cape Verde. So having that in my identity has really been the most important variable in my understanding of multilinguals. So don't be impressed about the bio that Heather read. It's really my experiences as a person of color, as a English language learner, that has really fueled the passion that I have in preparing teachers for this particular field. So as we continue, let me tell you about the problem of practice that Rachel and I found as teacher educators. We often struggled, right, with the completers. And in looking at their superficial awareness of cultural deficiency discourse, and how they did not necessarily challenge to the extent that we wanted the English speaking hegemony that exists in the American school system. As a result, we as a result we often talked about this, rising multilingual learners that we see across the nation. We also saw that there's quite a bit of disproportionality that we see in research in terms of their achievement outcomes, right? And their own experiences in the American school system. Another thing that concerned us, and you probably are feeling it too, is this overt xenophobic and racist discourse that we currently feeling, and that's deeply hurtful. Of course, that all this in a background where we have most of our teachers are white monolingual speakers of English, right? And in the meanwhile, our student population is highly diverse. So looking at all this in light of that deficiency discourse and learning outcomes of multilingual learners, it became really important for us to study more, right, and figure out ways that we can get our teachers where they needed to be. So as we continued, and I believe I'm gonna pass it along to Rachel to talk a little bit about um, some of the efforts and where those efforts stem from.
Yeah, thanks so much, Leila. So we were noticing that cultural deficit thinking really eluded efforts at elimination. And that this was not just our experience in our program, but also something we were finding in the literature. And, we really felt that TESOL practices hadn't comprehensively addressed the issue. So as we were really thinking through what we were doing and what other programs were doing, we landed upon some common practices, which included exposure to counter narratives or the stories from diverse perspectives as a tool for opening up the worldview of teachers. We also saw a lot of programs were working with critical positionality statements. That was something we were doing as well. And we also saw community inquiry, like reaching into who is the community that your students, that you serve as a school. And we saw that we were doing these pieces and a lot of programs had been doing these pieces, and yet it didn't seem to be doing enough to disrupt deficiency perspectives in the long term, right? And so that teachers were able to kind of talk the talk, but not really walk the walk when they were out in the field. They weren't operationalizing this disruption and deficiency discourse. And so we were really trying to think about, well, how can we do something more? And so we decided, well, what happens if we take these practices and we put them together over time? And we established this plan where over 2 full semester courses with 2 professors, Leila and myself, we would do this ongoing engagement, right? Not just a one-off, but just continuing to interact with stories at various intersections of identity and experience, and to use those stories, those counter narratives, to develop positionality statements, but to continue to come back to them. So it wasn't, again, a one and done sort of thing. So these were the gateway courses of our program. The first 2 courses in the program, we sort of wanted to give the teachers a critical shock. It's a graduate level program, and so our teachers were all in-service teachers seeking certification to support multilingual learners in their classroom. The first course I taught was on second language acquisition theory, and we actually, in addition to many short counter narratives, we also read a full memoir of experience of a multilingual learner coming of age in the United States as an immigrant. And we used that in the first course to craft a linguistic positionality statement. After that, the teachers were sent off to Leila's course, which was on sociocultural foundations, where she engaged with a variety of stories every week, with reflections on those stories, reflecting back on the self. And this all culminated in a comprehensive positionality statement. But we weren't done there. After we'd sort of done this ongoing engagement across these two courses, it culminated in a community inquiry project. And the fact that the community inquiry project was a culminating activity felt very important to us. Our own sort of experience, as well as what we found in the literature, told us that sending teachers off into communities that were perhaps different from their own identities wasn't productive. It wasn't good at disrupting stereotypical thinking unless it was prefaced and supported in careful ways. So we felt the counter narrative and the positionality statements might be just the thing teachers needed to go off into that community inquiry, which, by the way, included mapping the community for resources, as well as interviewing parents and stakeholders to really think deeply about their lived experiences. Our aim in this work was really to better understand if illuminating the lived realities of others through these counter narratives and through community inquiry could foster an asset-based understanding of the teacher self as well as others. And if this could then lead to more inclusive and equitable pedagogical practices. We really wanted to try to disrupt the deficiency discourse in a long-term kind of way. So to do this study, we were guided by two theoretical frameworks. The first is critical race theory, which has been much maligned in public and political discourse of late, but we think is an incredibly misunderstood often theory, but important one. And we leaned on it because it really helped us think about how colorblind ideologies fail to recognize the existence of systemic inequity in the United States, and that those who have privilege have a lack of incentivization to dismantle those inequities. Another really important aspect of critical race theory that really helped us think about the purpose of counter-narrative and positionality is that everyone has a multifaceted identity, a complex identity. And critical race theory helped us recognize that there's power in naming your own identity. And when you can recognize the complexity in your own identity, it becomes easier to recognize and seek out complexity in other identities. And counter narratives are a nice way into this work. The other theoretical frame that guided us was Yoso's work in community cultural wealth. And Yoso really extends the idea of funds of knowledge. She takes a more critical approach to funds of knowledge, and she has developed this framework for naming capital from an asset-based perspective. So the capital that exists in our culturally and linguistically diverse communities, these forms of capital are things like aspirational capital, linguistic, familial, social, navigational, and resistant capital. So she really gives us language to name what we're finding in the experiences and communities of our learners. So what did the study look like? Essentially, we recruited 6 participants from an intensive TESOL cohort, which was made up of 12 white monolingual teachers who were working in an urban district in the northeastern region of the US. Though they were all seeking certification to support multilingual learners, they all already had those students in their classroom. In terms of our methodology, we chose a post-structural narrative inquiry approach. So let me sort of deconstruct that for a moment. Narrative inquiry we chose because we truly believe in the power of story, and following Connolly and Clandon and this idea that humans make meaning through story, right? And that's how we transmit our value systems, our beliefs, our knowledge through story. And narrative inquiry creates this really nice space for the researcher to be within the story of the participant and to find each other in relation and make meaning together. But the reason we took a post-structural approach is traditional narrative inquiry kind of takes the story of the participant and recodes it and restories it. But we really didn't want to claim the power of ownership over those stories. So we chose this post-structural approach, which allowed us to sort of not code the stories for meaning like we knew that meaning, but to take the participant stories and look at them through a theoretical kaleidoscope, which is a really interesting process for us. In terms of data collection, we had 60 to 90-minute semi-structured interviews with our participants about 6 months after those 2 gateway experiences. And that timing was intentional because we could feel that the experiences in our classes were meaningful and there were a lot of aha moments. But what we wanted to know is if they lingered and actually had an effect on teacher practices. So before I hand it back to Layla to start telling a little bit more about what we found, I think it's really important to note where we started. And our participants had a really broad range of experiences and awareness, most sort of shockingly represented by this quote from Wendy, who is a experienced teacher. She'd been teaching for, I believe, 19 years at the time of the study, but she had been emergency certified to support multilingual students for 16 of those years. Now, of note, in our state, emergency certification is only supposed to be allowed for 1 year before you have to begin actually seeking that certification. So this status, she had worked with a lot of multilingual learners over the years, and this status eventually caught up with her in the district, and she was compelled. Actually, all of our participants were compelled to seek this certification. And Wendy says, I remember saying to my students, please stop speaking Spanish. We are an English classroom, so you need to speak in English. And they would say, yes, ma'am, and did what I said because I was going to call their mom if they didn't do it. And so here we can see this almost painful sense of what it meant to be in a classroom, in Wendy's classroom, where it was English only and nothing else was really of any value. And there was a culture of control around that language. So that's where we began.
Excellent. And let me tell you a little bit about what we found, given that Rachel just finished by giving this Wendy's code. So the first thing that we found was that those with the least starting awareness made the biggest strides. For an example, stories, a lot of the stories that they read really served to meet them where they were, right? For an example, Linda says, students are able to start where they can, and that's okay. This idea of where do you start when you begin with students, right? It alerted them to that importance. Second, they came to realize that reflecting in their own experiences mattered in understanding the experiences of others. For an example, Kevin made statements as to the recognition of his privilege and the need to have others feel comfortable with this recognition. Martha, on the other hand, reflected on her own language loss within her family, which she always thought of it as a choice, that the family had a choice of letting go of the primary or not, and just made the choice to lose the primary. She came to understand that it wasn't really a choice, that in the context of English as a dominant language, they really did not have the ability to keep that primary language. And she saw that as an important marker. While Linda reflected in, as a white teacher, monolingual speaker of English, teaching in a very diverse setting, she felt that variable of being in the minority, right? And that shaped her understanding about the importance of lived experiences. Also, we really saw that those that with the longest road, that came way in the beginning, really traveled so far to understand a lot of what we were talking about. For an example, again, Wendy says, this is going to sound terrible, but in your class, and she was saying this as she was talking to Rachel, right? This is going to sound terrible, but in your class, you started to talk about white privilege. And I honestly was offended, thinking, what is she talking about, white privilege? I'm not privileged, right? So those were important comments that we drew from a lot of the interviews that we did.
Yeah. And as we sort of thought through the stories of our participants, what we came to know was that that gateway course sequence really mattered. One of the initial things that sort of set us into this study was that we were finding that even though our teachers were writing positionality statements, it was kind of like they were checking a box. And we really found that this ongoing engagement over time across 2 classes helped us to avoid checking the positionality box. Now, Linda was the only participant to note that she initially struggled with criticality, that she saw this as an assignment and she wanted to please us when she was writing her positionality statements and reflections. She wanted to get a good grade. But then as we kept pushing and exposing her to stories, she really came around to see the value. And honestly, all of the other participants noted an immediate benefit. Kevin talked about the power of manifestation, that really naming your own experience and identity was powerful for him. Catherine noted that it helped her peel back and realize that it wasn't that she didn't have interesting experiences, it's just that she wasn't really seeing them at first. And the stories, those ongoing counter narratives that we expose the teachers to, really made barriers that students experience evident. So Kevin said that they helped him realize that his common experience was actually uncommon when it came to thinking about the families his school served. Linda noted that she was seeing for the first time the learning ecology of her school was really exclusive of many of student identities, that if you were to walk through the school without any teachers in it on a Saturday, you wouldn't know that it served so many multilingual students. Those resources were really invisible. And Wendy came far, right? You know, remember Layla said, I offended her at the outset. And then suddenly she really came to see that these systemic issues that she hadn't thought were real were. And I think what we found that was super important in that process of coming to awareness, of making the invisible visible, was that it's really hard to mute multiple voices. So, you know, Wendy noted that the white professor offended her at the outset, but the stories were like this constant drumbeat, and it got louder and louder because the message of, you know, diverse experience, diverse access to opportunity, privilege, bias, power, was coming from a lot of voices. My voice, the voices of the authors, and very importantly, also the voice of Layla as a woman of color. And we found that when we were all saying the same story, that drumbeat got louder and louder and became really hard to ignore. Linda noted also that it was just important to hear from so many voices, to recognize how important it is to honor people for their differences, that the differences are a beautiful resource. And we also found that the gateway experiences that culminated in community inquiry were really important, and that seeking out story within community through interview was effective because the teachers had developed some important sense of, you know, who they were, and a better sense of criticality in terms of systemic inequity. And you could see this in the stories they told us. Rose noted that she used to think of her district as an inner city, and now she realized it was a place with a lot to offer. And Catherine is a lifelong resident of the district. She came to see the diversity as a resource. Kevin, you know, really made an interesting observation that he was learning to flesh out cultural nuance. Previously, he would refer to his Spanish-speaking students as just Spanish, and none of them were actually from Spain. And he learned to flesh out that, you know, there were so many cultural backgrounds represented by the Spanish language, and he was kind of learning more about what it meant to be Dominican versus Puerto Rican, as an example. For Wendy, so much happened through the experience of mapping and interviewing the community. She really came to tell us that she would drive in and out of this district, and it wasn't until she had to map it in this way and introduce herself to people in the community that resources became visible to her. They were invisible. And Rose started to dive deeply into the socio-political history of the community that she didn't know about, that explained, you know, why communities were there, why the demographics were changing, how communities came to find each other and, you know, establish themselves in this district. And overall, the stories of our participants just, you know, really conveyed a heightened sense of humanity in the multilingual community that they were serving. And we were really happy to see that our teachers, as they were developing this own sense of who they were through story, they were also really coming to recognize the complexity of identities of their multilingual learners and families. And Linda says this, in a really concise but perfect way. Everyone has a story. And all of our participants started to really express the value of knowing more than what home language a student speaks, but also what that means in terms of their dynamic cultural practices, beliefs, and values. So the third major theme that we found in our study was that these additional forms of capital in the community really sharply came into focus, and in an asset-based way. Kevin came to see how much care there was in the community, the way families took care of each other, helped each other. And we see in Wendy, again, a really dramatic change in perspective. And I think this quote is important to read as she reflects back on who she is now at the time of the interview and who she was at the outset of the cohort. And Wendy says, I think that, in my situation, I'm completely honoring and respecting the students and really growing with them in a way that's helping them to come out of their shell and understand that they're awesome. And it doesn't matter if they speak Portuguese or Spanish or, whatever, English only, it doesn't matter. Whereas that was not reflected in my classroom before. So of course, I kind of feel bad now when I look back. I'm like, oh my gosh, those poor kids. And so if we recall where she started in that sort of classroom of control and English only, she made dramatic strides in really valuing the linguistic resources of all of her students, and was a completely different teacher because of it. Catherine also really had an interesting perspective that we thought was important to share with you all. And she came to see that being white comes with power. And it's important to teach kids about that power so it doesn't just remain in the hands of the people who already have it, right? Really thinking about her classroom as a place of power sharing. And Catherine had another story that we were excited to share with you. As I mentioned earlier, she was a lifelong resident of the district, and her vision of the district had really remained static until she engaged in this ongoing work. As a teenager, she had worked in a Polish deli, and there was a pretty vibrant Polish community at the time. And they would come in and speak in Polish and joke. And she would recalls being frustrated that they weren't speaking in English, they were in America. And after engaging with all of these counter narratives, she revisited that experience and realized that this was a form of resistance, right? That these Polish immigrants were sustaining their language, their culture, their shared humor in a way that was really important and pushed back against the dominance of English. Even though they could speak English, it was such a pleasure for them. And she came to appreciate the Polish deli as a really important cultural space. But Catherine also came to see navigational capital in the community. She, at the time of the study, had recently welcomed a new family from Vietnam. And she reflected on the fact that in the past, she would have really encouraged that student to just speak English and encourage the parents to just speak English with their child. And now she was really thinking differently. She could recognize that perhaps those parents in speaking just English to their child and trying to avoid Vietnamese with their child were perhaps trying to navigate the system. They saw the importance of English. And Catherine was able to recognize what the parents were trying to do, but to meet with them, spend time with them and say to them, don't worry, English will come along, but your Vietnamese language is really important, and it's important that your child is bilingual. And she raised funds with the library to get bilingual books in English and Vietnamese. She developed signage around the classroom and really established a wonderful working relationship with these parents, which was revolutionary for her indeed. And all of our participants really came to think about multilingual families and their aspirations for their children through a new lens. And part of that new lens was recognizing that in many ways their school ecologies were not welcoming to those families. And they were starting to experiment with how to make them more welcoming. And they also were had an expanded understanding of family roles and how those could vary culturally. So they weren't just looking through their own lenses, but they were really making an effort to look through a broader lens at who their families were. Overall, we saw that sharing languages, fostering multilingualism, and expanding the worldviews of the monolingual students also became really important to the participants. So Marta noted this, that after she came to discover that many of her emergent bilinguals were actually American born, and they were navigating these complex bicultural spheres. And she became a real advocate for helping them maintain their home languages as English and content were developed in school. And so she sort of had a very new focus in her work. And that was really something we saw overall, that our teachers went from not knowing what languages students were speaking at home to now not only knowing it, but incorporating it, valuing it, and inviting it in to classrooms. So it was a pretty dramatic experience for the participants and for us.
So all of these findings and all of these participants, what they were saying, really led Rachel and I to think seriously about what are the implications for practice, right? And we begin by really thinking about how important those gateway experiences are, and the need for those gateway experiences to engage self, other, and community in a deep and meaningful way. Furthermore, we also looked at how white English speaking educators need to develop and to continue expanding critical consciousness. But really, we had this conversation that this is not only white English speaking educators, that even educators of color, and we didn't have any participants of color in our particular study. But one of the things that we thought about is what are the implications for teachers of color, right? It's that they also need to continue expanding this critical consciousness, right? One of the things that in reflecting about myself is I had to come to accept who I am, despite being of color and the position that I hold in this society, because that had an implication in the way that I related to other people. And because of that, we not only felt that this was important for English speaking educators, but if you were to replicate this experiment, you also need to look at the importance of this particular factor for teachers of color. In reality, uh, teacher preparation or teacher development, call it whatever it's called, it needs to continue. This act of reflecting on self and others, of becoming acquainted with community from multiple places, right, is incredibly important for teacher development and for sustaining, particularly for teachers that sustain multilingual diverse learners. Um, right. Well, participants in this study, participants began challenging that hegemony, right? And we began seeing this challenge even in the practices that they did in that classroom. For an example, they began considering the learners wholly, like the whole learner, not only, the learning outcomes, the achievement outcomes, but also who these children are and what are the experiences that they've had. They showed a real interest in learning not only from the student but about the student. They definitely began encouraging home language and authentic communicative interaction, but not only between their students, but also between the adults that touch their students. They challenged a lot of their own personal assumptions of cultural practices, right? And the function and rules of communication, how important those are. They began what I generally used to tell Rachel, oh my goodness, they're soft to the touch, meaning that they became more aware of social political events, right? It started hurting them deeply and they started talking about it. And the other thing that they began doing is really looking at American history and rethinking where do we begin telling the history and how do we tell that history. And a quote that was really important for us in understanding this change and these implications became from Wendy, where she said, we are all just kind of taught the very pretty story of the whites are wonderful. And, nobody wanted to be a slave owner and nobody, ever wanted to hurt a Native American. And we want to believe that, but that's just not true.
Yeah, and if you recall where Wendy started, that's just a dramatic shift in her positioning. And
Yeah.
so we just think in terms of additional implications for practice that the representation and collaboration in teacher education and teacher development matters a lot. Remember, it was easy to dismiss me as a liberal white professor, and it was easy to dismiss Layla as playing the victim, playing the race card or something like that when we were alone. But when we started doing this work together over time, it became more powerful. And so we think it's really important that there is intentional recruiting of more racially, culturally, and linguistically diverse faculty at institutions of teacher education. But we think it's not enough just to have diverse people come together and do this work. We think that there also needs to be efforts to really foster cross-racial, cross-cultural collaboration. And that requires, a culture of safety, listening, allyship, and reflection, and really being open, even as teacher educators, to listen to the stories and experience of our colleagues, our students, their families. And we think that this work should be embedded throughout pre and in-service teacher education, that this engagement with new stories should continue for all of us. Another thing that we found was really important was that this criticality, it was important to build capacity in it. And our participants felt that they were able to enact change in their practices because they had come through this training together as a cohort. So they felt that there was power in number. And that was really interesting in terms of an approach to bringing stories to schools, is really thinking about doing that together. They also felt that it would be really important to expand this work, that this thing that they had done in terms of counter narrative and positionality and critical inquiry, this engagement with story, should be expanded to administration, that every adult that students come in contact with and their families come in contact with should be thinking about who they are in this work, where they have access to privilege, power, and bias, and how they can understand their communities from an asset-based perspective. So when Layla and I talk about this research, we're always very excited to share this research. But the question that we get most is, what are the stories you use? And so we will share, if you would like to know what stories we've used and what counter narratives were important to us, we can certainly share those with you. But we think it's really important to note that there really is no recipe for this process, that the engagement with story isn't and shouldn't be a one-size-fits-all approach, that we selected the counter narratives that spoke to the communities we serve, and that we felt addressed our students, in this case, the teachers' level of awareness and current events. And so as we do this work, we are always sort of refining the menu, let's say, of what stories make sense. And that's an important part of the collaboration as well, is that continuing to think about what's our challenge and how can we think about addressing it very specifically. So that's the work we did with stories to transform TESOL teacher preparation. Thank you so much for listening. We would be really happy to take your questions or your comments, or just engage with you.
Thank you so much, Rachel and Layla. First of all, just fascinating. I was fortunate enough to see your TESOL presentation where you talked about this research study, and it's just wonderful to hear you talk about it again in this tailored format, if you will. Yeah, we'd like to open up the floor to questions. Feel free to unmute and give us a question, or if you feel more comfortable, you can put something in the chat bar. And I can tell everybody was fully engaged because nothing came up in the chat bar while you were talking. Everybody's just completely zoned in. listening to what you're saying. So I'll just open the floor if anybody has any questions. And again, if you want to put it in the chat, I can read it out for you.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
So thank you so much for this great presentation. I'm curious how you like to use or you're using your like teacher narratives or teachers' experiences in your, if any, in your undergrad teacher preparation, like those who maybe don't experience this yet because your graduate, I might have missed that part, but I guess these were teachers who were in a graduate program, right?
Yes.
So, do you have any plans in terms of how to use your data in different ways?
Yes. So we actually, we have, switched our roles, but before leaving, we developed pre-service teacher courses that mirrored these gateway experiences and actually went through the same process, right? We really had those first two courses in pre-service, the first two courses relating to working with multilingual learners that did the same work, that engaged with stories. And here it felt even more important to make sure that the pre-service teachers did a lot of work diving deeply into stories and deeply into their own identity before they were set off to a community that they might be working in, right? So they didn't have a community they were currently working in, but we kind of had a sense of where our teachers were heading off to and had relationships with those districts. And we didn't want to just set them off without that same work. And that was because of what we found in the research as we were beginning the study. And is that community inquiry is often something that pre-service teachers are asked to do. But if it's not done carefully, it can do the opposite of what it's intended to do, and that is reinforce negative stereotypes that people may have of certain communities. And so, yes, it is also sort of quite productive at the undergraduate pre-service level.
What I would say, Ali, I would agree with Rachel. Just a reminder that often pre-service teachers tend to be younger, while the teachers that we certify, because it's a graduate level program, they tend to be older and have a little bit of experience with multilingual learners. So it's important to attend to that while pre-service teachers are younger, because they might, it might require, and this is me theorizing, right? It might require a little bit more intentionality in understanding their stories before you even choose the stories for them to read, right? Because they're in a different place in their lives, okay, coming into the, and they don't know the profession as well most often than those already in-service teachers coming into the graduate level program.
Yeah, and actually, Layla, to build on that point, I think the cool thing that we found about stories is almost like you could think of them like an onion, right? That there's every story has a lot of layers to it, and a lot of ways you can either dive really deeply into it, or you could take it at a more superficial level. And people with less awareness, the story gave them a pathway in. In other words, they didn't have to jump right into the middle, but they could peel away layers through interaction, discussion, reflection, and then that was an effective approach.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. I am doing similar work with undergrad, so I would love to reach out to you and
please do.
Yeah,
we would love to talk more for sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
Hi, I had a question about the age level of the students that the teachers are working with. Are they all through K-12? Are they younger? Are they older? And then also wondering, you mentioned the stories, and I guess I was unclear, and maybe you said this and I just missed it, but are the stories coming from students or from other teachers, or who are the stories from? Because I work with more young students, elementary age, and I was just wondering about using their stories that they.
Awesome question. I'm going to let Rachel add to whatever I tell you. For an example, first of all, because they're in the graduate level program, and this is a gateway course, right? We get the whole spectrum, PK through 12. So we can have any of those, could be at any grade level. And because it's a master's degree program, generally the same, they're all already teaching, right? They're teachers coming in already with sometimes anywhere from 2 to all the way 16 years of experiences. Like you saw Wendy, that had that emergency certification for quite a long time, right? Um, Rachel, I don't know if you want
Yeah,
to add anything.
so thank you. And thanks for the great question, Martha. Um, the study was with K through 12 teachers, but in subsequent iterations of it, of this work, we also worked with PK teachers.
Yeah.
And to address your question about the source of the stories, we actually, it was kind of interesting that you said you work with really young learners, because one thing that has struck us often is how painful it is when you go into a school, even children as young as pre-K, who are internalizing this message that English is the more important language, and they're starting to not want to speak their home language with their parents, which we think is terrible and painful, right? Certainly not the intention of education. Is just, no one becomes a teacher to strip a language away from someone. So in terms of the source of the stories, we tried to get as many sort of first person narratives of experience as we could. And, for example, a great memoir that we often read with our teachers is Burro Genius by Victor Villaseñor. And he's writing as an adult, but he's reflecting on his kindergarten experience and how painful it was. And so you get that perspective of the child all those years later. There's another great article from Rethinking Schools called Colonizing Wild Tongues. I think it's by Artse Gocha. And she also reflects back on this experience as a 5-year-old, where she realized when she entered the school that a part of her was savage and a part of her was civilized, and that was associated with the language and the language she was allowed to speak in school. And so I think in terms of the source of the stories, we sought out memoir. We actually used a lot of the stories of my students from a previous institution where I worked, where I had developed a blog with my international students, reflecting on their own experiences and their experiences in coming to school in America. And so those stories were deeply personal to me because I knew the students, but were really powerful in terms of thinking about all kinds of intersections of identity. And another source of stories for us was not just limited to the written story, but we sought out videos, interviews, Native American experience. We sought out news stories. At the time we were doing this study, there was a lot of, scandal about children in cages at the border. And so we looked for stories of the why would a family come to a border, right? To really counteract the news story and the negative political discourse about the immigrant as just a terrible and dangerous other. So the stories really abound. And then the other thing that was really important is that the community inquiry allowed the teachers to gather their own stories from the community, right? Because part of that was interviewing parents, interviewing community business owners, and so much percolated up from that. And so the presentation of those stories, or really the stories of the families in the community, mattered as well.
Yeah, I would only add that the one thing that we found to be very important as teacher educators in this trajectory is to be very, very careful with what's happening at the time when you're offering the stories contextually, right? Because often Rachel and I found ourselves thinking, oh, the student said this, we need a story about this, so it can counter whatever the student said, and it could challenge the student to think deeply about that particular subject matter. So it did require that we take careful notes, that we pay very close attention to what they were saying, and that we constantly reflect, her and I, about, given this comment, what are the story, or given what happened in the news last night, what other story could we bring?
One quick follow-up, just when you said that, they did the community inquiry, so they did gather stories from there. What about taking the storying or the narrative to their pedagogy with their students, like eliciting stories that way? Did anyone go that way? Is that any part of the what you're teaching about?
That is so interesting, right? Because our work in terms of this study sort of stayed there with the community inquiry, with them taking the story. However, I can tell you that in terms of instructional strategy, even helping them learn oral history and use that with their students, so their students can then reclaim their own stories, has been something that Rachel and I have talked about, has an important continuation of this work, right?
Mhm. And we did see that the participants, some of the practices that, that were new for them were that they were, in addition to really sort of trying to know the students well, they were coming to know that by asking the students, right? And encouraging the students to, do all about me projects that were meaningful and interview family members and present that back. And they were also making those resources more visible. So like in the example of the Catherine's new Vietnamese student, when you went into her classroom, there were now signs that were also in Vietnamese. And that was really, really meaningful to the other students, because instead of that Vietnamese child being now someone who just didn't have English, he was a child who could read that magnificent script, right? And that was like seemed magical to the other students. And so, the domino effect of what these small tweaks to their practices did was enormous in terms of just the culture of openness and empathy in their classrooms.
Yeah. And Martha, I believe that you had mentioned that you are pre-K, right?
No, just elementary age.
Elementary. Okay. So one of the things that was striking for me, right, as a foreign-born person, right, was that the way that the teachers did not realize that a lot of the kindergarten students were actually born in America and multilingual learners, right? They looked at them from the perspective of, oh, they're Hispanic or they speak Spanish or whatever, but they didn't see that other identity that is American. They're American citizens. And when we actually had them, part of the community project was actually them collecting data from the district and from the states that they're in looking at the children, who the children were. And there was this brief moment in time that they're looking at each other saying, oh, but they're born in the United States. And yeah, they are, So that was really interesting for us to see that.
There's this expanded sense of identity throughout, right?
Yeah.
That these children, maybe they immigrated from another country, maybe they were born here, but they had this bicultural experience. And that was complex, right? And full of rich resources, and also something that children need help navigating, because they often experience this, well, I've got one foot in this home culture and one foot in the school culture, but what I don't have is 2 feet anywhere, right? And that sense of belonging can be challenging. And so the teachers having more awareness of that, right? Coming of age is challenging for every kid, but I think there's this layer of complexity to the bicultural experience that I think can be the focus for the teachers through story, through really thinking through the lens of other people's experience for a moment. And when they came back to their own lens, they found it a little bit bigger, which was exciting.
You know what's interesting? I have a good friend of mine whose parents are Indian, but she was born in New York. And when I discussed this research study with her, in talking to her about this research study, she looks at me perplexed. She says, oh my goodness. I said, what's going on? She says, when I was in first grade, when I went to my very first time that I walked into my first grade class, my teacher looks at me because she looks Indian, right? And my teacher says, oh, you're so pretty. Where are you from? And she turns to the teacher and she says, New York. And the teacher says, no, really, where are you from? Right? And she lives with that memory forever. And I remember talking to her and saying, it's much more interesting that you haven't forgotten this, and you're now close to 50. She's 49 years old and she still has this story. And she says, I don't think I realized how much it impacted me. People questioning me being an American when I was born in America, and that's all I know because of the way I look. You know what I mean?
So I think we have time for probably one more question. If anybody would like to ask a question of our presenters. Okay, if nobody's going to take the opportunity, then I'll ask my questions. So
Great.
you all know I'm super fascinated by this work. And one thing I realized just now is that when I work with undergraduates, and they're, of course, white, monolingual, like most of our pre-service teachers are in this nation. I realize that when I hear them say things that I think we need to adjust that show a lack of understanding or whatever of multilingual learners' experiences, my go-to is facts. So if somebody says, oh, all of those kids, they're coming here to go to school. Well, actually, 80% of our elementary school multilingual learners are born in the United States. And so that is my go-to. And I think actually with some of my students that reaches them. But I think having the stories also is really important. So I can present the facts and do that, but then following it up with stories, or doing stories and then facts, or whatever it is. And I think actually a combination of both of those will make my teaching much stronger.
I love that. Thank you for saying it, Heather, because what we find is that there are people who respond to facts and statistics and history, but that the story, because stories are the way we do connect with each other, the stories sort of inflate that history, like in the sense that they bring it to life. And sometimes the story resonates more than the fact, or the story gives a frame or a perspective to make the fact make sense, right? Or to give it additional definition. So we think that the story is the most important part of it.
And it's so interesting because often one of the things that I've come to realize in the power of stories, right, is that stories serve a multitude of things, right? They do not only serve to help you grow, to develop, to look at other points of view, but they could serve to stereotype, right? Because if we look at it from that point of view, a lot of people will say, oh, they may stereotype. They may say, oh, Italians are loud and they love to speak. And if you ask them, well, how do you know that? They will tell you, I once had a friend, and they go back to the story to explain that particular stereotype, right? So use of stories is really important. It's almost like the human being is programmed for stories.
Yeah, I think
right?
so.
And even if you look like from the perspective of the Bible and all the stories in the Bible that teach to behave in a certain way or to look at something from a certain way, you really see this power that stories have, yeah, it's fascinating. It's fascinating.
Yeah.
Well, I think that is a perfect place to end, with the power of stories. And I know that all of us have really enjoyed hearing about your research project and hearing your own stories as well. I just want to thank all of our participants again for joining. Please be on the lookout. We will have another webinar of this format in July. We have somebody talking about stories on TikTok, so that should be super interesting. In June, however, our next Teacher Educator Interest Section newsletter is coming out late May, early June. And the plan in June is to have a town hall, more discussion related to the articles that are going to be coming out in the newsletter about storytelling. So I hope you all will join us then. I also just wanted to say that today, this was a webinar very academic, focused on a research project. We are also throughout this whole year going to have some that are, I don't know, I want to say more about practitioner experiences. So we're working on some teachers coming to tell their stories and having conversations in that way. So I really hope that all of you can join for future webinars as well. And thanks again to Rachel and Layla. That was
Thank
wonderful.
you.
So much.
Thank
It
you
was our
so
pleasure.
much.
Thanks everyone for
Thank
coming.
you.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Heather.
everyone. Take care. Hope you have a great rest of your day.
Bye-bye.